Good morning. Hope you're all doing well and we're experiencing the joy of the Lord even in these times of trial. But we can trust that our Lord is still on the throne and that He has good things in store for us as we approach Him. That being said, we want to begin today in the third module of the course. We want to go into the New Testament. We want to begin to explore the wonder of this period of the Bible. The Old Testament, or the Old Covenant, is basically referred to in biblical terms as the covenant of the law. And of course, we enter the New Testament, the New Covenant, and here it is largely and generally called the covenant of grace. Obviously, in the coming of the Lord Jesus, this new covenant where it's not what we do that gets the eyes of God upon us. It is the grace of God, what He does for us, that is in view here. So that's the general view of both covenants, the testaments that the Old Testament and the New Testament provide for the Bible. Now, let's begin by going through this third PowerPoint. We have a lot of ground to cover, obviously, because of the coronavirus that has infected the planet, and so we've lost a week of time, and so we're going to have to really push through this next couple of weeks to finish on time. But we don't want to miss any of the important points, so we're just going to move rapidly through them. So let's pull up the PowerPoint. I'm going to collapse this screen and go to the PowerPoint. What we have here, we've been looking at this sketch, this rendering of John the Baptist baptizing Jesus. So here we are entering into this New Testament that begins with the story of Christ and His work in the world. But let's begin by just doing quickly a backdrop study. What leads up to this point in time? The whole of the New Testament can be seen to take place within a 100-year period of time, beginning with the birth of Christ and concluding with John writing the Revelation in about 95 AD. That's the large consensus of opinion as to when John concluded the New Testament by writing Revelation is about 95 AD. So we're looking at about 100 years of time that comprises the entire New Testament. The Old Testament consisted of about 4,000 years of time, starting with the creation and then concluding with 400 years of silence. So here we are beginning at the first century AD, and let's just look at some of the things that we've touched on during the intertestamental period. We had Alexander the Great actually enter the scene roughly about 400 years before the coming of Christ. We see that he conquered the land. Ultimately, he built an empire, and that empire was established as a kind of a unified empire by interjecting the Greek language into every land that he conquered. And also with that came the Greek philosophy and the Greek culture of the Olympic Games, the Greek theater, and so on. We saw when Alexander the Great died that two of his generals occupied lands that were on opposite sides of the land of promise. The Ptolemies, they took over the land of Egypt, and the Seleucids took over the land of Persia, up near Assyria. And these two warring factions then used Israel as a buffer state. And as such, they were disenchanted with all these military conquests, marching through their land, taking their crops, pillaging their banks, and so as a result, Israel was impoverished, and they rose up under the Maccabees and destroyed the Assyrians as they came down. The Maccabees took over the control of the government and of the temple during the days after the slaughter of Antiochus Epiphanes. And ultimately, Rome comes in and about 146 BC destroys Carthage and begins to grow as an empire. I do need to speak just for a moment as to the Maccabees and what changes took place during the intertestamental period because of their conquest of Antiochus Epiphanes and then their control of the religion and government of Israel of the day. There were two groups of people that arose during the time of the Maccabees. Obviously, there was the very conservative group of people. They were known as the Pharisees. The Pharisees looked upon the Maccabees as a delivering force that was brought about by the power of God. I hear this small little family and raising up a small ragtag army conquers this Assyrian empire and their general. And so the Pharisees looked at the Maccabees as a deliverer, just like one of the judges of the Old Testament. And so they were praying that this would be a return to the days of David and Solomon, where once again the glory of Israel would be established in the earth. And the fact that they were now in control and in power over the government and also the religion by taking the temple under control, they looked upon them as truly a judge of their day. However, the Maccabees were not very religious. They were not very centered on the law and bringing back those great and glorious days of Israel. They were very, very much independent, and they were looking for an advantage for their own lives. So much so that they took the priesthood and they sold it. They sold the power of the priesthood to a group of people that became known as the Sadducees. And those realities really infuriated the Pharisees. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees became mortal enemies across the divide of Jewish life. So that's where these two groups really begin to develop into the power struggle that we see in the first century. Well, Rome comes into power, begins their exercise of power about 146 years before the birth of Christ, when they destroyed Carthage, their great enemy. The empire is actually established about 100 BC, so 100 years before the birth of Christ. Rome really begins to solidify themselves as an empire, and they begin to march across Middle East lands. Julius Caesar takes control of Rome in about 49 BC. Now, Rome up to this point had been a republic, a nation that was governed by a Senate, a representative government. And Julius Caesar, by the time he takes a position in the place of the president of the Senate, he begins to exercise a little more power than what the Senate was representing the people in. And so as a result, the Senate kills Julius Caesar in the Senate, and they want to put down this idea of an empire with an emperor, and they they actually kill Julius Caesar in the Senate. But nonetheless, they continue to advance through Greek lands, and ultimately the concept of a Caesar, a dictator of supreme power, gains foothold there in Rome, and they become an empire, and that lasts well into the period of the AD. So Egypt becomes a Roman province in 31 BC. If you've ever read the story of Shakespeare telling the story of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra and Mark Antony, we see that Rome and Egypt become allies, and ultimately Cleopatra marries Mark Antony, and so Rome and Egypt become a unified whole. Egypt is brought into the empire, and ultimately Judea becomes a Roman province in 6 AD. So that's not too long before Christ's birth that Augustus Caesar makes the decree that the whole world should be taxed, so that he can identify and get a census of all the people of the land. So this is the beginning of the story of Christmas that we find in Luke and in Matthew. All right, so let's begin looking at the four Gospels. With that background, Rome has now come into power, and Christ is born. And now, after his death, burial, and resurrection, four great accounts of the life of Jesus are written. We call them the Gospels. So let's kind of begin here with our study of the New Testament, looking at the Gospels. First of all, the word gospel means good news. Now, I think this is significant because what Christ is doing in the New Testament is not establishing a greater law, another way of handling the sin of people by producing a better law, a greater force of commandment over their lives. What Christ brings into the world is good news. The news that humanity cannot gain access to God through their own efforts, which is the basic concept of law. You are becoming responsible for your own behavior, and you must make amends. You must bring yourself into compliance with the will of God, and that's the way you accomplish access to God. Well, that's what the Old Testament has proven, is that man cannot, he doesn't have the capacity to keep the law of God. The heart of man is deceitful, it's full of sin, and therefore it must be dealt with in some other way. We cannot forcibly control our lives. We just don't have the willpower. That's what the Old Testament has proved. So now, God sending his own Son into the world to redeem us, the sinners that we are, God has come to redeem us because he is the only one that can overcome sin. And the fact that he makes access to God available to us because of his work in our lives, that's good news. So that's a great way to introduce the New Testament. This is the good news of what God is going to do for sinful man. So we have four Gospels. Three of them are referred to as the term synoptic. Now, if you've noticed over the couple of months of this class, the amount of time I spend with the terminology of the Bible and actually words in general, you can actually see in this word that it actually self-defines itself. We can actually take the word synoptic and we can work through what it means. The prefix SYN, we have that prefix many times in English words, because this is a word that has come over from the ancient Greek. And a lot of our English words have the very same origin. We look at the Greek language as a kind of a base for many of our English words. Well, what are some English words that have the prefix syn, like synchronize, synonym? These are words that we use, and you can see this prefix syn. And we know from looking at those words, synchronize my timepieces in the house. What I'm doing is I'm putting everything on the same time. So the word syn, or the prefix syn, means same. Well, the word optic, and we can see the word optic in this word, synoptic. Optic has to do with sight. We go to look through optical lenses when we are looking either through the telescope or the microscope. We go to a optometrist when we are going to have our eyes examined. So this word synoptic means see the same thing. And there are three gospels that are grouped together, in this term, synoptic gospels. They see the same thing. Now, the best way to understand this is look at a traffic accident in an intersection. You have three people on one side of the intersection and one man that's on the opposite corner, and he sees the very same accident that takes place in this intersection. And the policeman comes and he interviews these witnesses to this accident. And the three on one corner are going to say, well, we saw this car approaching from the left and it was coming to the right, and it hit this car that was in the intersection. Well, that's what the policeman takes as the report. These three confirm that they're seeing the same thing and they've given the same report. The man on the opposite street corner, when he's interviewed by the policeman, he says the car came from the right and came to the left and hit the car that was in the intersection. Well, that sounds like it's opposition to the three that have witnessed on the other side of the street. But actually, because his perspective is a little different, his testimony becomes a little bit different. But it's all seeing the same accident, but from different viewpoints. And that's the way we see this concept of the synoptic gospels. You have three gospels, the authors that are writing from one perspective, and then the fourth gospel is written from a singular perspective on the opposite side of the street. So let's kind of walk through this and understand it. So the synoptic gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And by this we will understand that these three gospel authors are looking at the life of Christ, the work of Christ, from a perspective that is different than the Gospel of John. Now, what is that perspective? Well, in general, most scholars look at the fact that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a lot of similar storylines. In fact, there's a lot of information that looks to be copied from one to the other to the other. The shortest of all of the Gospels is the Gospel of Mark, and it's a very truncated, very sharp and crisp Gospel. And as you read it, you almost get the impression that Mark is late, and he's trying to get this done as quickly as he can. And so the stories are not elongated, they're not exaggerated in scope, gathering all kinds of detail. He just tells the story real quickly, and then he's finished. Well, logic would say that if things are being copied from one source to another, and the second source is longer than the first source, that would mean that Mark wrote first, and then the other Gospels were written afterwards, and Mark's work was incorporated, copied over into some of the sequences of these other Gospels. And that's exactly the way it appears. It appears from this that Matthew writes next, and he takes a lot of the information that Mark has written. And then third gospel is Luke, because he includes much of what Mark wrote and what Matthew wrote. And so this is a way to see the sequence of these gospels as they came about. One of the things we always want to identify is who is the author, what then is the audience he is addressing. Each of these has a significance to the storyline because everybody has their own way of saying things. Everybody has their own foundation of thought. They bring to the storyline a little bit of their own personality, and there are different audiences. And as you would approach a different audience, you would change your way of speaking to make sure that the audience could grasp what you were saying. If I was teaching this class to a group of sixth graders, I would always monitor the language I would use. I probably wouldn't use the word synoptic because they wouldn't be able to identify the prefix and the suffix of the word as college students do. So I would change my speech, my way of handling the content to make it fit for the audience. And this is exactly what the gospel authors did. Each had a particular audience, and so we need to understand the audience to understand the way the gospel was written. We also want to look at the timing of the writing. When did it take place? And then from that, we can get a little bit of the purpose of the writing as well. So those are the concepts we're going to look at as we go through these four Gospels. The fourth Gospel is the Gospel of John. And we'll deal with John in a little more detail probably next week. But just to introduce the Gospel, John's Gospel has a very high view of Jesus. Now, by that, I'm not saying that Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not look on Jesus with a wonder and a glory and an honor. But John, let's just say that his view begins with such a high view of Christ that we just need to honor at the very beginning of any treatment of the Gospel of John. Now, why would I say that? Well, I think the easiest way to identify John's perspective on Christ is let's look at the way his storyline begins. Well, let's compare that first with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke begin with events of the Lord Jesus' life after his coming to earth in at the beginning of the first century. We call that event the Incarnation. And here again, you can look at the way the word is put together, Incarnation of Christ Jesus. This is where Christ became flesh. Well, the word carne in the original Greek, which then has had its influence in many different languages, especially the Latin. We see the word carne in Spanish, for instance. Chili con carne means chili with meat. Well, so the incarnation is the coming into flesh of the Lord Jesus. So the Lord came into the world in a moment of time through the birth of the Lord Jesus in the household of Mary and Joseph. And this was his incarnation. He became flesh. Well, that moment is defined in John as a very special moment because the eternal God was now being made a man. And that's not to say that Matthew, Mark, and Luke didn't recognize that Jesus was God. but their storylines begin at the incarnation of Christ. When John begins his gospel, he begins with the creation of the world, and he starts with the phrase, "In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made." But then in verse 14, he says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." And we'll deal with this in some detail, but so John's gospel does not begin with the birth of Christ. It begins with the creation of the world, and Christ, the Son of God, the eternal Son of God, was there in the beginning and was actually the mechanism of creation. So this is why we say John's view of Christ is so high. When we look at Mark's gospel, Mark begins the storyline of Christ with Christ's baptism when he's 30 years old. So we don't even have a storyline in the Gospel of Mark about the birth of Christ. So we only really see about 3.5 years of Christ's life in the whole story of the Gospel of Mark. Matthew, however, starts with the birth of Christ, with just a story of the wise men coming to the manger. And so this is the way the Gospel of Matthew begins. So it begins with the birth of Christ, but it does not go into the eternal life of God that began the creation. When we get to the Gospel of Luke, Luke also tells of the birth of John the Baptist, who is the beginning of the New Testament. John the Baptist is the last prophet of the Old Testament period. He comes in 400 years after Malachi, but he begins to prophesy and make the way for the entrance of Christ Jesus. So John the Baptist's story is told by Luke in the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. But then we look at the fourth gospel, and here we're seeing the very creation of the world. So it demonstrates that there is a different view that these gospel authors are bringing into it. Now, I do want to make one comment here. I do want to reference the fact that we're not looking at biographies of Christ. The Gospels are not biographies of Jesus. They simply don't fulfill the definition of a biography. And by that, let's look at what biography means. Bio means life, graph means writing. So this is the writing about a life of an individual. And although we can say there are elements within the Gospels of biographical sketches, they are not complete. Biographies, if you were going to write a biography of John Kennedy, for instance, or Donald Trump, what you do is you begin with the entire background of his life. You begin with his birth, his parents' names, where he was born, his education, the schooling that he chose. Ultimately, you'd begin looking at his young adult life, then into his adult life, and then ultimately all that he accomplished, and then his death. Well, when we look at the Gospels, we don't see all of that information available to us. Like I said, Mark doesn't even include anything before Jesus is 30 years old. So we couldn't call Mark's Gospel a biography. It's too exclusive of all of his life. And when we get to Matthew and Luke, who just have a storyline of the birth of Christ, a little bit of the content surrounding the birth of Christ, and then one storyline when he's 12 years old, when he comes to Jerusalem for the very first time, and he's there speaking with the elders. That's the only childhood event we have of the Lord's life. We don't know much about his schooling. We don't know about his training. It jumps from age 12 all the way to the age 30 when he goes to be baptized by John. And then the major storyline is what takes place in the 3.5 years of his public ministry, and then his death, burial, and resurrection. So we couldn't call it a full biography. It just doesn't have all the content that would be found in a typical biography. So what do we call these Gospels? The better way to phrase it, rather than a biography, we are looking at a theological narrative. That's a good way of understanding what the Gospels are. A theological narrative. Well, here are two words that we need to kind of unwrap for us. And let's look at the word narrative. Just means a story. So we're looking at the storyline of Christ's life, but it is a theological story. In other words, there's a theological content and a theological purpose. Each of the authors wants to tell the storyline of the Lord's life from a perspective that has a theological intent. In other words, each gospel author has a particular purpose for the writing, and so everything they have in the writing is going to push the audience toward that conclusion. Now, are they manipulating the storyline? Are they fabricating the story to kind of meet their agenda? No, they're not. They're not fabricating. They're telling the story, but they're choosing elements of the story of life of Christ that will communicate that particular theological purpose. We do this all the time. If I'm telling a story about my family and I'm trying to tell the story in such a way that I'm communicating the relationships I had with my brothers and my sister, I would tell the stories. I would leave out certain parts. I would add certain elements of the story that would communicate what I was trying to convey, the relationship that my siblings and I had. However, if I was going to tell the storyline in a way that communicated my education, I could tell the very same story of my life, but I could leave out a lot of the details about my relationship with my brothers and my sister. It's not that I'm fabricating, I'm just taking the storyline and using the storyline to communicate a certain perspective. And that's exactly what the gospel authors have done. And we'll show you this in a minute. So what we have is a theological narrative. There's a specific theological purpose that the storyline follows to convey these very important theological purposes. So that's a good way of looking at what the Gospels are. Okay, let's go on. The Gospel of John has brilliant composition. By that I'm saying it is masterfully put together. The content it speaks to this theological intent that John has in such a wondrous way. And as we get into the Gospel of John, we'll see how it's brilliantly composed. He uses Koine Greek. Now, every language, as it develops a common way of speaking and then a classical way of speaking. If you wanted the classical English, you would actually look at Shakespeare. Shakespeare speaks with a classical English, and so it's somewhat difficult for people to read without, picking up a dictionary and looking up this word or that word. So Shakespeare does not deal with common English, the English of the street, the common man. And so it is with the language of the Greek world. There was a classical Greek. That language would have been communicated by Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey. There's a common Greek language, the language of the street, the language of the child. And so John writes in koine. Koine is the Greek word which means common. We actually get our word communion or things in common from that Greek word koine. But he writes in the common language of the street because he wants everybody to be able to read his gospel. He doesn't want just the educated and the scholars. He wants everybody to be able to pick up his book and read it because he wants everybody to know of the life of Christ. And it is such a beautifully composed book. It is wonderfully written that for centuries, since John wrote the Gospel of John, for centuries, people that were teaching Greek would use John's Gospel even in a secular setting. They were using John's Gospel as a primer for the Greek language. So it's a fantastically composed book. He has a masterful use of contrasts in the Gospel. He uses, for instance, I think a great way to see these contrasts is to compare chapter 3 and chapter 4. Chapter 3 deals with Jesus and a man by the name of Nicodemus. Nicodemus is a man. He's a ruler of the Jews. He's very well educated. He's a teacher of the law. He's in the governmental positions of the Jewish empire. The term is Sanhedrin. We'll talk about that a little more as we get into the life of Jesus. But he's a part of the Sanhedrin, part of the ruling body of Israel. Although they were under Roman rule, Rome allowed the Jewish people to have their own government, or their own court system. And that's where the Sanhedrin comes into play. He is a part of the aristocracy, very well known, very highly respected. So he comes to Jesus by night, and he asks Jesus of some questions, and it's obvious he is searching. He's a searcher. So quite a contrast that here's an aristocrat, a man of letters, a man who is highly respected, a man in authority, and yet he needs Christ. And he comes to Jesus by night. He comes in the middle of darkness. So you compare that third chapter of the Gospel of John with the fourth chapter, and Jesus is in Samaria. Samaria is hated by the Jews, and yet Jesus goes there to meet with whoever he can bring to the saving knowledge of Christ Jesus. And so he meets a woman of Samaria, not a man. So compare that to the third chapter. Jesus dealt with a man in the third chapter. Now he deals with a woman in the fourth chapter. She is not highly respected. She's a woman of ill repute. She comes in the middle of the day. She comes to a well, the woman at the well, and she comes to speak with Jesus, who's sitting on the well, and here's a Jew speaking to a Samaritan. She's not highly respected. She's on the lowest rung of social society. And Jesus knows that she needs salvation as well. So it's quite a comparison. There are lots of comparisons of light and darkness throughout the gospel. But the gospel is universally inclusive. He wants to speak to both Jews and Gentiles. Jews being the people of God of the Old Testament. Gentiles are everybody else. If you are not a Jew, you are a Gentile, the nations of the world. And Jesus speaks to all people. And so the Gospel of John is all inclusive. Everyone is to be able to read it and see the need for salvation. And there's one powerful purpose. John is the only gospel author that actually states the purpose for the gospel. We go to the conclusion of the book, and we find a statement where John actually makes the purpose well known. He said, "Now I have chosen many of the stories of Jesus' life, and I've chosen these specifically. I could have written many, many things about Christ's life, but I've only written these because I have one purpose in writing them. I wanted these to convey to you that Jesus is the Christ, he is the Son of the living God, and that you might then have faith in him and come to salvation, and that your soul might be redeemed." So he actually tells us that he has not written everything of the Lord's life, but he's only chosen certain elements out of the Lord's life to bring people to faith that he is the Son of God. We've already looked at the land of Palestine, so I'm not going to spend time going through these maps, although I did not show you this. This is a satellite view of the land of Palestine, and actually we're looking at it from the north, looking south. We have here the coastline on the Mediterranean, and it sweeps around toward Egypt. Egypt is in the very background here. Here's the Red Sea with the two arms of the Red Sea. This would be the Sinai Peninsula, and we see the Dead Sea at the base of the Jordan Valley here. So Jerusalem would be up on this mountain range right here. Notice how arid this land is out on these very large expanses of land, very, very desert-like appearance. We've looked at these elevations of the Holy Land, these cross sections. So we're just going to skip right past this. And we're going to look at the people of the New Testament. First of all, we're introduced to a lot of people in the New Testament that we have not encountered in the Old Testament. And as I said, the term Gentiles just refers to everybody else who is not a Jew. Now, as we get into the New Testament, we're going to see more and more involvement with the people of the world. Although there are nations that are mentioned surrounding Israel in the Old Testament, we don't see a lot of interaction between the people of Israel and these nations. When we get to the New Testament, we're having lots of interaction with the people of the world. We see that they're all speaking Greek, so there's lots of commerce that's passing through Jerusalem and Judea because of the central location of the land. We see lots of Romans here, people coming from all parts of the known world, and they pass through. And so here we see this interaction of the people in the world. So the Gentiles takes a very high place of prominence in the New Testament. The Gentiles are generally classified as Greeks, because everybody speaks Greek. Even though now the Roman Empire has come and taken power, it has taken power in the land of promise in just a few years before the birth of Christ. And so we really haven't seen a transition in the culture where they're all speaking Latin. So the Greek language still has a predominance, and so the quick way of referring to all the Gentiles as a whole, as they're interacting with the people of the Promised Land, is just refer to them as the Greeks. We also see the Romans brought into a singular profile as the people of Rome are occupying the land of promise. You have Roman soldiers, you have centurions, you have a prefect, procurator. These are the terms that we find in reference to the people of Rome, but they are still having an influence in the Greek land, and so the term Greeks is used as a full classification of all the Gentiles. We also see the Samaritans. We talked a little bit just a minute ago about the Samaritan woman, the land of Samaria, and how this section of the land of promise was avoided by the Jews. They would go around the land of Samaria when they went from Judah all the way up to Galilee, because they hated the Samaritans. So the Samaritans were referred to in the terms of Gentiles. Let's look at the uttermost parts of the earth as a way of describing everybody else. So there are people that come up and they visit Jerusalem from Africa. The Ethiopian would come up to visit the land of promise, up to see the temple of Herod in Jerusalem. And so you have Ethiopians, the uttermost parts of the earth. You have Spaniards that are mentioned, barbarians in the regions of Germany and North Europe. But Jesus makes comment that the gospel is to be spread into the uttermost parts of the earth. Now let's talk a little bit about the Jews. When we talk about the Jews, there are terms that can be used interchangeably. They're synonymous with each other. The concept of the Hebrews, the concept of the children of Israel, these are all terms that are synonymous with Jews. But let's look at the Jews in particular and the different segments of the population. Well, I also need to bring this into view, that the term sons of Abraham or the seed of Abraham are also terms that can be applied to the Jews, the children of Israel, and the Hebrews. So every now and again you'll hear them talk about, we are sons of Abraham. So again, this is a term that references the fact that they are part of the chosen people of God. All right, in particular, we have this storyline of the Galileans versus the Jews. So these are both considered Jews, but the Galileans were a separate segment of the Jewish population. They lived up in Galilee. They were blue-collar workers, whereas in Jerusalem, down in Judea, you had more cosmopolitan, more urban society. The aristocrats lived in Jerusalem. There were no aristocrats that lived in Galilee. This was a segment of the land that was used for agriculture and for fishing. Not very sophisticated, not very scholarly compared to Jerusalem. So there was a separation of the Jews and the Galileans, although they were all Jews. We see this really come to the foreground when Jesus chooses Galileans for his disciples. For the most part, they're all Galileans. And as they come down to Jerusalem to worship at the feast, you could almost see people looking at this ragtag band of disciples that this rabbi is leading, and going, "Oh boy, a bunch of hicks coming from the regions in the north, and they're really not very sophisticated at all." And so it was almost a put down when they referred to them as Galileans. We did have the Pharisees. We see them arise into a position of authority because of their numbers. They were the conservatives of the day, and because they were conservatives, they had power in their numbers. They're just the great multitudes of Pharisees. They're very conservative in their viewpoint. Compare that with the Sadducees. These were the progressives of the day. They wanted to advance the society in their own way rather than go back to the laws of Moses. They were smaller in number, but they had a power because they were wealthy. Remember, they purchased the priesthood. They now had the precincts of the temple under their control, and the temple was a money maker. Tithes and offerings had to be paid by every Jew to the temple, and so it was a money-making proposition for them. And so the Pharisees, who were the strict conservatives, really disliked the Sadducees. They thought they were in a position of power that they did not belong in rightfully. That was a place that was supposed to be held by the sons of Aaron, the original high priest, and now they have purchased this with money, and now they've become wealthy, and that's where they had their power. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees were always at odds with one another, and they really only come together when they are going against a common enemy. And in this case, they come together and they crucify Jesus. This itinerant rabbi from Galilee becomes such a threat to them that they join forces and put him to death. There's a group of people that are referred to as zealots. I think a good way to refine the meaning of the term zealot would be take the term Pharisee and say, okay, a zealot is a Pharisee on steroids. He's just absolutely militant in his view about the conservative nature and that things should go back to the ways of King David and King Solomon, and they were ready to take up arms and forcibly bring this to pass. It is ultimately the zealots that rise up and create a war with Rome that ultimately will destroy Jerusalem in 70 AD. Interestingly enough, there is a zealot in the company of the disciples. Jesus chooses a zealot. His name is Simon the Zealot. And he is part of the band of Jesus' disciples. There's a group called Herodians. Herod was the puppet king of the day. When Rome came to power, they put a man by the name of Herod in as the king of the Jews. And what is interesting about Herod, he is not even a Jew. He is an Idumean. He comes from Esau. He does not come from the line of Jacob. So he does not come from the 12 tribes of Israel. He's from Idumea. And so he was hated by the Pharisees because he wasn't even a Jew. And here he is, the king of the Jews, placed there by Rome. He's a Roman sympathizer. So he wants to ingratiate himself to the Romans. So he does a lot of things to gain their approval. He builds a lot of towns and cities. He builds the one on the coast. He actually builds a deep water port. Fascinating engineering feat. Israel has no natural harbor, and so he builds one, and he calls it Caesarea, and in name of Augustus Caesar, Caesarea. He builds a city in the very north of Israel called Caesarea Philippi, and so he's honoring some of the family of Caesar. But he also is a great master builder, and he builds the temple of the Lord to ingratiate himself to the Jews. So, but he does attach to the head temple the Tower of Antonia, the place where the Romans are in power. So he's trying to kind of straddle the line between these two cultures, Rome and Jews. But the Herodians were a group of people that saw the way that Herod lived. Herod would go and worship in the temple to try and gain some benefit from his position as the king of the Jews. He would go worship in the temple, but he lived like a Roman the rest of the week. And so here were a group of people that saw that, okay, I can do things according to the law, go worship in the temple, gain some notoriety among the Jews, but I could live like a Roman the rest of the week. That's very much a picture of some people in our churches today. They go to church on Sunday, but they live like the world during the rest of the week. So as many things change, they stay much the same. So Herodians, a group of people that kind of grew up in the shadow of Herod and took on his lifestyle. There were a group called the Essenes. These were a group of people that were absolutely disenchanted with the world of first century Palestine. They saw the bickering between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They saw the Sadducees controlling the temple of the Lord. They saw Herod, the king of the Jews, was not even a Jew. They got fed up with the Jewish culture, and so they decided to separate themselves, just go and live in their own communities out in a place where no one would bother them. So they went down and took up residence down near the Dead Sea. Who wants to live down near the Dead Sea? Very hot, very dry, very difficult living conditions. Well, the Essenes went down there and they started to build a city there called Qumran, and there they took up the job of copying out the scriptures. And so centuries later, almost 2,000 years later, a little shepherd boy was down by the Dead Sea. He was leading a group of goats down by the Dead Sea, and as he was watching them, he took time to throw rocks up into a cliff because there was a cave up in the cliff. I guess we could call this ancient basketball. And he was throwing this rock up through, trying to see if he could enter the cave with this rock without hitting the sides of the cave. And sure enough, at one point, he throws a rock and it goes directly into the cave, and he hears the smashing of pottery. Well, he goes down as best he can into the cave to see what on earth is caused this shattering of pottery. And he sees in this cave a series of big earthen jars, some of them as tall as 4 feet tall. And in these earthen jars, he sees scrolls of parchment and papyrus. So he takes a little segment of one of the papyrus rolls and he takes it to the town and he shows it to the elders of the city, and they recognize this is a major archaeological find. The Essenes had been copying out the scriptures and putting them in clay jars and storing them in these caves to preserve the ancient scriptures of the Bible. We call these the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the greatest archaeological finds in human history. Because here have been scrolls that have been hidden for over 2,000 years, and we could look at them and see a little of the culture of the first century, and even before, even into the period of BC, the first century before Christ's birth. And the reason this is fascinating is that let's take the scroll of Isaiah. They discovered a scroll of Isaiah intact in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and scholars of the last century, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1948. And there were scholars that had looked at the Bible for almost 2,000 years. They had kind of come to some conclusions. And one of those conclusions was that How could Isaiah see the crucifixion of Christ Jesus, which would take place about 800 years after his writing? How could Isaiah pinpoint so exactly what was going to take place on the cross of Christ and the way he died and the work of Christ in redeeming sinners? So many scholars came up with this idea. Well, there's no way that a person 800 years before the event happened could so accurately predict it. So probably what happened is sometime during the Middle Ages of AD, some well-meaning church scholar, when they're copying out the scriptures, they changed Isaiah to make it match the history that they wanted to convey. So we call this a revisionist history, where they're modifying the language in such a way that it makes it fit with their own agenda. So here were these scholars that were saying that the church fathers in the Middle Ages changed the script of Isaiah, and now it matches what they believe happened with Jesus when he died. So here is a discovery where they've pulled out scrolls that have been buried for over 2,000 years. Before Jesus is born, these Essenes have been copying out the scriptures and storing them up. So here we have a pristine look at what Isaiah wrote. And so these scholars they heard that there was a discovery of the book of Isaiah, a full intact. It's about 18 feet long, this scroll of Isaiah. And they wanted to go read, especially Isaiah 53, which is the great prophecy of the suffering servant of Christ. And so they go and they pull out this scroll and they want to look and see exactly what did Isaiah write, because surely this Middle Ages well-meaning church scholar would have changed the words to make it fit the belief system of the church. And sure enough, as they began to read Isaiah 53 out of the scroll that came out of the Dead Sea caves, it says exactly what our Bibles do today. There was no change of the words. Isaiah actually wrote that Christ was going to be crucified between sinners, that he was going to be buried amongst sinners, that his death was going to pay for the iniquity of all the world. It's amazing that we have a biblical storyline that's intact. It's not changed and twisted by church fathers that are trying to push their own agenda. So those were the Essenes that stored the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's the concept of rabbis and disciples. These are the way the education process took place in that day. Each rabbi, each scholar would take a group of students and teach them, whether it be a trade, whether it be a particular viewpoint of the law of Moses, whether it be a particular philosophy. Education took place through rabbis and scrolls. Rabbis is a term which means master or teacher, and the disciples were apprentices, and they were trying to learn the ways of their rabbi, their master, and ultimately become like their master. This was the whole concept. And so each of these schools would be a rabbi and his disciples. When we get to the conclusion of the course, we're going to talk a little bit about the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul studied under the Rabbi Gamaliel, a great scholar in ancient Jerusalem in the first century. And so he left his town of Tarsus. He's Saul of Tarsus when he's born, and he takes upon himself the name of Paul when he's converted to Christianity. and now he is Paul, but he has studied under Rabbi Gamaliel. Now, Rabbi Gamaliel would be like saying in our world that Paul went to Harvard or Yale or Princeton, one of the highest schools of thought. Well, Paul studied under Rabbi Gamaliel, so he was under one of the greatest teachers in Israel. So there were lots of rabbis and lots of disciples that were trying to gain education. Some of those rabbis were itinerant, like Jesus was an itinerant rabbi. And so he would take his disciples with him on journeys and teach, at locations all around Palestine. Some rabbis were situated in Jerusalem, and they received disciples from all over the known world. They would come to study in Jerusalem under Rabbi Gamaliel. And so the concept of rabbis and disciples was not new with Jesus. Let's talk a little bit about scribes, priests, Levites, publicans, and lawyers, and then we'll be finished with this particular lecture. As we enter the pages of the New Testament, we find that these terms come to light as Christ is going about his world and teaching his disciples. We find that scribes would come up to him and ask him a question. I think the easiest way to understand scribes is scribes are, let's say they're the first century Kinkos, where you would go into Kinkos to have a document printed or prepared. Well, writing materials were not that prevalent. Not everybody had writing materials in your home. So if you wanted to write a letter to your relative who might be living in Judea and you were living in Galilee, you'd call for a scribe. He would come with his ink, his pens, his parchments, and he would write out your letter. And actually, he would make sure it was delivered. And so a scribe was very knowledgeable, worked with letters all the time, worked with words and phrases. And actually, because the greatest written work of the day was the ancient Old Testament, he spent his time reading and copying out the Old Testament. And so the scribe was a scholar, an authority about the Word of God. And so many scribes would come to Jesus and say, Rabbi, tell us, what is your interpretation of this particular phrase or this particular passage out of the Old Testament? One scribe comes to Jesus and said, what's the great commandment in the law? So we see scribes come into view many times in the storyline. Priests, well, the priests of the first century were Sadducees. They were from the offspring of those that purchased the priesthood from Judas Maccabeus. And so the priests were still looked upon as holy people, but yet the Pharisees looked upon them as Sadducees, and so there was some discord there. But we see the priests of the New Testament, we need to understand their origin and how they play into the storyline of crucifixion of Christ. Levites were people that come from the tribe of Levi. They were the ones that were chosen by God to be the laborers in the temple. So Levites, we find them throughout the storyline of the New Testament. And we find that the term publican comes into play. Publican is a special class of Jews. They actually sold out the Jewish people. They became Roman in their thoughts because they actually gave themselves over to become tax collectors. So the term publican actually is in reference to a tax collector. And the tax was a Roman tax placed upon the Jewish people. And here was now a Jew who was collecting tribute, tax money from his own people, the Jews, and giving it to the Romans. And here's the way it worked. The Romans demanded a certain dollar figure for every Jew. That was their tax. But they allowed the publicans to charge any amount that they wanted. And what the publican collected over what the Romans required per person, that was theirs to keep. So the publicans could charge extraordinary taxes upon the Jewish people. And they had the Roman legions, the Roman soldiers behind them to enforce their payment. And so these publicans were getting rich on the backs of their brothers. We find storylines in the Gospels of Jesus talking with publicans. A man by the name of Zacchaeus became extremely wealthy by extorting money out of the Jewish brethren. But Jesus leads Zacchaeus to salvation, and he gives back all that he has taken that was outrageous. Actually, a beautiful fact here is that Matthew was a publican. The gospel author Matthew was a publican, and Jesus chooses him to become part of the disciples. And he walks away from his tax collector table and he follows Jesus, ultimately becoming a great minister of the gospel. The other term is lawyers. Here were scholars that would spend their time in the law. This is all they did. They were looking to gain authority and position by their knowledge of the ancient Old Testament. And the lawyers would come up to Jesus and they would question him on the meaning of some of the words of Moses. Well, that concludes looking at these figures from the first century Jerusalem. We'll talk about some of these as they interact with Christ. And we'll conclude with this slide. I hope you have a great weekend, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.